Officer Daniel Briggs had been through house fires, hostage situations, and meth lab busts. But nothing. Not the screams, not the blood, not even the day his own partner got shot, could compare to the chill that crawled up his spine the moment his canine refused to step foot through that door. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was trained by the Department of Defense, had served overseas, and once sniffed out a pipe bomb hidden beneath 5 feet of gravel. But on that Wednesday afternoon, in a quiet neighborhood in Oakwood Hills, Shadow did something he had never done in 6 years of service. He stopped, he stared, and he growled, low, guttural, primal, at a house that looked perfectly normal on the outside. The 911 call came in at 3:42 p.m. A neighbor had reported a bad smell and hadn't seen her elderly neighbor in over a week. Dispatch labeled it a standard welfare check, and Daniel, recently rotated back to patrol after 6 months on a federal task force, took it without thinking twice. The address was a modest, well-kept ranch-style home on a cul-de-sac. Lawns trimmed, cars parked neatly, no signs of forced entry, no screams, no signs of panic, just an unnerving stillness that didn't sit right. "Let's go, buddy," Daniel said, grabbing the leash as Shadow hopped down from the back of the cruiser. Shadow sniffed the air, tail wagging slightly at first. But as they stepped onto the front porch, something changed. The tail went rigid. The ears pulled back. And just as Daniel reached for the doorknob and gave the signal, "Clear!" Shadow froze. The dog braced all 4 paws, planted firm like concrete, and let out a low, vibrating growl that Daniel felt in his chest. "What's the matter, boy?" he whispered. "You're supposed to go in." Shadow didn't move. Daniel crouched beside him, checked his eyes, ears, nose. No signs of pain or injury. But the dog's stare was locked on the wooden door like it was a threat. He stood up slowly and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Police department, anyone home?" Still nothing. Shadow backed up slightly, his hackles raised, his growl deepening. That's when Daniel smelled it. Not strong, not yet, but it was there. Metallic, faintly sweet, and unmistakable to any cop who'd been on the job more than a month. Blood. The door was unlocked. Daniel announced himself again, pulled his sidearm just in case, and pushed it open. "Police department, I'm coming in." The first thing that hit him was the warmth. The thermostat must have been set high because the air was thick and stale. The second thing was the music. A slow jazz tune playing softly from somewhere deeper in the house. The third was the smell. Iron, fat, something cooking. "Shadow," he whispered again and tugged the leash gently. The dog whined but held his ground. "Fine, you hold position." Daniel stepped in alone. The house was neat. A little too neat. Magazines lined up on the coffee table. Mail stacked in perfect order on the hallway console. A faint trail of what looked like tomato sauce ran from the front door to the kitchen tile. But it wasn't tomato sauce. He knew that now. As he stepped into the kitchen, a slow cooker simmered on the counter, releasing steam. A woman stood at the sink. She turned slowly when she heard him. Her eyes were red, her lips cracked. She wore a yellow apron with a flower pattern. A name tag on her blouse read Marissa. "Mrs. Keller?" Daniel asked, his voice low but steady. She nodded. "Your neighbors were worried about your husband." She wiped her hands on the apron. "He left town. Conference in Boston." Daniel glanced at this calendar on the fridge. No travel dates, no reminders, no itinerary. "You mind if I take a look around?" She hesitated just a split second, then smiled. "Sure." As Daniel moved toward the back of the house, Shadow barked from the front porch. One loud, sharp bark, then another, then 3 in a row, alert pattern. Daniel spun. The dog was staring directly at the slow cooker. Love stories like this? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel Heroes for Animals for more real-life tales of bravery, instinct, and the incredible bond between dogs and humans. Daniel's stomach dropped. He turned back to the kitchen. "What's cooking?" Marissa froze. "Just beef stew, my husband's favorite." He walked toward the counter. "No need to touch that," she said quickly, stepping forward. Daniel moved faster. With one quick motion, he lifted the lid. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. A hand, a human hand, pale and bloated, floated in the middle of a stew of potatoes, onions, and carrots. The fingernails were intact. The ring finger bore a thick gold wedding band. He didn't yell, didn't reach for his radio. He simply stepped back, weapon drawn, and said, "Marissa Keller, don't move." She looked at him, blankly at first, then calmly walked to the sink and reached. Too fast. Daniel reacted on instinct. "Hands up!" She stopped. Shadow barked again from outside. "Step back, ma'am, slowly." Marissa held up her hands, breathing heavy now.
"I didn't mean to," she whispered. "He said he was leaving. Said he was done with me. He couldn't just leave. Not after everything. I gave him my life."
Daniel moved in, cuffed her hands behind her back without a word. As he read her rights, the only sound in the room was the slow bubble of the pot still simmering behind them. Outside, Shadow sat by the cruiser, eyes still locked on the house. He hadn't needed to see what was in the pot. He'd already known. The cuffs clicked around Marissa Keller's wrists with a sharp finality that echoed off the spotless kitchen walls. Her hands were trembling now, not in fear, Daniel thought, but in exhaustion. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just deflated. Like a balloon that had been slowly losing air for days and finally gave out. Daniel kept one eye on her while reaching for his radio. "This is Officer Briggs, badge number 9417. I need immediate backup at 742 Waverly Drive. Suspect in custody. Possible homicide. Secure a forensics unit and notify the coroner." There was a pause on the line before the dispatcher responded. "Say again, 941 did you say homicide?" "I did," Daniel said, voice tight. "We have remains, human remains. Tell them to bring full gear. This house is a crime scene." Shadow whined at the threshold, still refusing to enter. Daniel met his eyes for a second. There was no fear in the dog's face, only certainty. He knew. Daniel walked Marissa outside and sat her down on the porch steps, out of sight from the kitchen window. He didn't want her looking at that pot again. Shadow sat protectively at Daniel's feet, never once taking his eyes off her. "You want to tell me what happened, Marissa?" Her eyes flicked toward him, bloodshot and empty. "He said I was boring, that I wasn't the woman he married, said he met someone new, a graduate student, 26, blonde, wrote poetry." Daniel stayed quiet. "He packed his bags 2 weeks ago, said he'd be back for his things after the conference, but I knew he was lying. There was no conference." Her voice drifted like a woman sleep-talking. "I tried to reason with him, begged, cried, promised I'd change. He laughed at me." A tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it. "So I waited until he went down to the basement to get his suitcase. Then I followed him with the meat mallet." She exhaled, long and hollow. "It only took one hit." Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. His training told him to remain neutral, to gather information without leading the subject. But inside, his stomach had turned to ice. The first backup unit arrived 5 minutes later. Officer Dina Walsh and a rookie named Caleb Martinez. Both went pale when Daniel briefed them on what they'd find in the kitchen. "You sure you want to see it yourself?" Daniel asked. Dina gave a stiff nod. "If we're doing paperwork tonight, I'm not letting you take all the trauma credit." They stepped inside with gloved hands and crime scene kits. Daniel turned back to Marissa. "I need to know where the rest of your husband is." She blinked as if genuinely puzzled. "I don't know, I lost track." He frowned. "What do you mean you lost track?" "I tried to portion him out. The big pieces went in the freezer. Some I tried to burn in the backyard fire pit, but it smelled too strong. I think the neighbors noticed, so I stopped." She looked down at her knees. "I thought if I cooked what I could, maybe it would just go away. Disappear, you know?" Daniel didn't respond. There was nothing to say to that. While the scene was being locked down, Daniel took Shadow around the perimeter of the house. The dog sniffed eagerly now, energized by the surge of adrenaline and the scent of blood in the air. They paused by the shed in the backyard. Shadow stopped, sat. Daniel opened the door. Inside were garbage bags, heavy, leaking. The stench was unmistakable. He called it in and stepped back. Crime scene techs would handle it from there. By sundown, the yard was swarming with uniforms, photographers, and forensic investigators. Crime scene tape fluttered in the wind like yellow ribbons tied to a house of horrors. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalks, whispering behind coffee cups and camera phones. Someone muttered, "She always seems so nice." Daniel had heard that line 100 times in his career. She always seemed so nice. It was practically the tagline of every gruesome case he'd worked. One of the techs, a seasoned guy named Andre, came out wiping sweat from his brow. Found bone fragments in the fire pit, probably skull, and some kind of jaw, Teeth are intact, so dental records should confirm. Daniel nodded. Any signs of struggle in the house?
None. Cleanest scene I've seen in a while. Too clean.
Premeditated? Andre nodded. She scrubbed like she was prepping for an open house. We'll find bleach traces everywhere. Daniel glanced toward the cruiser where Marissa sat handcuffed in the back seat, staring straight ahead. Later that evening, he filed his initial report back at the precinct. As he typed, he kept going back to one part of the story, the part that didn't make sense logically, only instinctually. Why had Shadow refused to go inside? The dog had walked into live fire zones, meth cookhouses, and a collapsed basement to pull out a dying kid. But today, in the safest neighborhood in Oakwood Hills, he held his ground, like he already knew. Captain Rains called Daniel into his office around 9 p.m. "You all right?" Daniel nodded slowly.
"Yeah, just trying to wrap my head around it."
The captain handed him a coffee.
"You did everything right. That woman, she's been planning this, probably for months."
"I keep thinking," Daniel said,
"if Shadow hadn't refused to go in, I might have stepped right past that kitchen, might have bought her story. Who knows how long it would have taken before someone figured it out."
The captain looked over the rim of his mug. "Maybe that dog saved your life, Briggs." Daniel didn't argue. He already knew it. By the time he got home, it was nearly midnight. He let Shadow off leash in the backyard, sat on the porch steps, and listened to the cicadas hum in the trees. He couldn't get the image out of his head. The hand in the pot, the gold ring, the calmness in Marissa's voice as she spoke about stew and betrayal and meat grinders. Shadow padded back to him and lay down with a groan, resting his head on Daniel's boot. Daniel reached down and scratched behind his ears.
"You knew," he murmured.
The dog gave a low grunt, tail flicking once. Across town at the county jail, Marissa Keller sat in a holding cell under 24-hour watch. When asked if she wanted an attorney, she said, "No, I just want to sleep." When asked if she regretted what she did, she said nothing at all. But before she turned away from the guard, she whispered something almost too soft to hear. "He said he was going to leave me like I was trash." And then she smiled. The following morning brought fog and silence over Oakwood Hills. On any other Thursday, Daniel Briggs might have spent the early hours sipping coffee in his garage, fixing up his grandfather's old motorcycle while Shadow chewed on a rope toy nearby. But this morning, nothing was routine. Nothing was quiet. His uniform smelled faintly of iron and stew meat. Even after a shower, he couldn't wash the scent from his nose. Sleep had been pointless. The hand, the ring, the pot. It all played on a loop behind his eyelids. When he pulled into the precinct just after 6 a.m., Shadow perked up in the back seat like he already knew they weren't done. They weren't. The Keller home had been secured overnight. Crime scene tape still wrapped around the porch, sagging slightly with dew. Inside, a forensics team was already at work. Cameras flashing, swabs labeled, photos of every inch of the house being snapped and cataloged. "Morning, Briggs." Andre, the senior crime scene tech, greeted him at the front door. "Hope you brought your coffee strong. This place just got worse." Daniel stepped inside and pulled on gloves. "What now?" Andre motioned to the kitchen. "We drained the pot. Confirmed the hand is real, obviously. Wedding ring engraved, to Robert always. It matches the missing husband. But get this, there's evidence she tried to bleach it before cooking." Daniel blinked. "What?" "Yeah," Andre said, "like she was trying to sanitize the crime. There's chemical traces in the broth." Daniel swallowed hard. "She tried to wash him before making stew?" "That's the theory." He didn't have a reply for that, just a long exhale. They moved to the laundry room. Blood evidence had pooled behind the washer, now fully pulled out from the wall. Beneath it lay a rolled-up bath mat, drenched and stiff with dried blood. Forensics had also found a metal meat mallet wrapped in a trash bag buried in the outside compost bin. "Used for tenderizing," Andre muttered grimly. Daniel crouched beside the bloodstains. "It's almost like she didn't even try to hide it, but also did." Andre nodded. Classic contradiction, wanting to confess but not get caught. In the hallway closet, they found several grocery store bags, receipts dated 10 days prior. Items included extra-strength bleach, industrial trash bags, duct tape, and latex gloves. All paid in cash. "She prepped for this," Daniel said. Andre agreed. "Not a rage kill, not entirely. This was simmering, just like the damn stew." Outside, Shadow tugged at his leash, tail up, nose to the ground. Daniel followed his lead as they circled the property. Near the rose bushes, Shadow stopped cold. He sat, then let out a short bark. "You've got something," Daniel whispered. With a hand trowel, Daniel started digging, slow, careful, precise. A few inches down, he struck metal, a burnt tin box. Inside, wrapped in layers of charred cloth, was a stack of partially melted ID cards, credit cards, and a flash drive. At the bottom was a small, half-burned photo, Robert Keller and Marissa on their wedding day. Her face had been scratched out. Daniel stared at it in silence. She hadn't just killed him, she'd tried to erase him. Back at the precinct, the interrogation room buzzed with fluorescent light. Marissa sat motionless in a hoodie and gray sweatpants, hands folded, ankles shackled. Detective Carla Monroe was conducting the first round of questioning. Daniel watched through the glass.
"Mrs. Keller," Carla said gently, "we found your husband's ring. We know the hand in the stew is his. What we need to understand now is why."
Marissa tilted her head. "Because he said I didn't matter."
Carla didn't flinch. "That's not a reason to kill someone."
Marissa's lip twitched.
"No, it's a reason to disappear someone."
She said it like she had rehearsed it. Carla leaned forward.
"Where's the rest of him?"
Marissa looked up for the first time.
"You won't find everything. I made sure of that."
She didn't elaborate. Daniel met with Carla afterward in the hallway.
"She's calm, too calm," Carla said. "Like she thinks this whole thing is a therapy session."
"She's not mentally unwell," Daniel replied. "Not in the way that gets her off the hook." Agreed, but she's emotionally calcified. No shame, no panic, just cold calculation. Daniel thought of the freezer, the receipts, the bleach in the pot. She didn't lose her mind. She made a decision. Carla nodded. And now she wants control of the narrative. By noon, the lab results started coming in. DNA confirmed the hand belonged to Robert Keller. More remains, bone fragments and teeth, were found in the backyard pit. Burn patterns indicated an open flame lasting several hours. Forensic dentists would need time to match everything, but preliminary analysis was grim. In the garage freezer, vacuum-sealed meat packages were labeled with dates, but not meat types. They were frozen solid. Human tissue would need to be slowly thawed before analysis. One of the rookies vomited in the grass when he saw it. Daniel walked back to the cruiser where Shadow waited patiently. He opened the back and let the dog out, then sat beside him on the curb.
"You knew, didn't you?"
he whispered, rubbing behind Shadow's ears.
"Before I saw the kitchen. Before she said a word. You smelled it, you knew it wasn't right."
Shadow leaned against his leg, eyes calm, breath slow. Daniel looked at the house. "Good boy," he said. That afternoon, a press release went out. "Woman arrested in gruesome domestic homicide" was the headline that hit every local paper. Online, the story spread fast. It wasn't long before national outlets picked it up. The term stew pot killer trended for the rest of the day. The department issued a formal statement crediting Officer Briggs and his canine partner Shadow for their quick thinking and restraint in uncovering a potentially concealed murder. But Daniel didn't care about press. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Marissa smiled when she said, "I made sure of that." That night, he and Shadow sat in silence again, this time inside the house. The TV on low volume, pizza box half finished on the table. Daniel finally picked up his phone and called his sister Maggie. "Hey," he said.
"You okay?"
she asked immediately. "Yeah, just needed to hear someone not lying." Maggie was quiet for a second.
"I saw the news. Jesus, Danny, was it really that bad?"
He looked at Shadow, then at his still-worn boots, stained faintly at the soles. "It was worse." The day after the arrest, the town of Oakwood Hills woke up with a hangover of disbelief. News trucks parked near the crime scene. Neighbors whispered like the tragedy might leak through the picket fences. And at the center of it all, the Keller home, once a model of suburban charm, was now sealed behind crime tape, its manicured lawn tainted with morbid curiosity. Inside the precinct, Daniel Briggs stared at the whiteboard in the case room. It had become a morbid collage. Photos of the backyard fire pit, close-ups of the severed hand, evidence bags tagged freezer remains. At the center sat Robert Keller's DMV photo, smiling, unaware he would become a cautionary tale carved into headlines. Daniel took a sip of lukewarm coffee. Shadow lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes watching every movement. Detective Carla Monroe entered with a slim manila folder. "Got the psych profile." "Already?" "Fast-tracked," she said, handing it over.
"Captain wants a clearer picture before the DA starts talking plea deals."
Daniel flipped through the pages. scanning notes from the forensic psychologist who had conducted Marissa's initial screening. Borderline narcissistic traits, no signs of psychosis, extremely high emotional suppression, elevated indicators of abandonment trauma. She's not insane, Carla said, reading his face. She's just angry, calculated, and emotionally numb. Daniel nodded. A killer who still loads the dishwasher. Later that morning, the team returned to the Keller home with a fresh warrant, this time to search the attic and garage thoroughly. Forensics had been thorough on the main floor and backyard, but with Marissa's last cryptic remark, "You won't find everything," no one was taking chances. The garage was dim and musty. Tools hung neatly on the wall. A riding mower sat under a tarp, but the deep freezer at the far end still buzzed like an accusation. Daniel opened it. Several bags remained, each one vacuum-sealed, stacked like leftovers. But this time, something caught his attention, a canvas bag tucked underneath the frozen meat. He pulled it out. Inside were legal documents, Robert's life insurance policy, his birth certificate, and, most telling of all, a signed divorce petition dated 2 days before he disappeared. "She knew it was coming," Daniel said to Andre, who stood beside him. "She didn't just react. She planned this." Andre pulled out a printed email thread between Robert and a local divorce attorney. The last message read, "Finalizing on Friday. She doesn't know yet. Pray it goes quietly." It didn't. Upstairs in the attic, Carla and 2 officers sifted through old boxes of books and holiday decorations. Near the far wall, Shadow sat abruptly and growled. Daniel joined them and watched the dog nudge a large plastic storage bin with his nose. "Got something?" Daniel asked. Carla popped the lid. Inside, wrapped in bed sheets, were several severed fingers, each one bound tightly in gauze. Daniel turned away, his jaw tightening. "Jesus," one officer muttered.
They were trophies,
Carla whispered. "Or maybe just what was left." They found another zip bag underneath containing a blood-soaked photo album. The images had been partially burned, but not beyond recognition. Wedding pictures. Robert teaching at the university. Marissa smiling, then slowly, across pages, not smiling at all. In the final photo, Robert stood alone on a beach. The picture had been stabbed repeatedly through the face with something sharp. Back at the station, Daniel sat alone in the report room with Shadow curled up at his feet. The weight of it all pressed in. The violence wasn't the hardest part, not for a cop. It was the intimacy of it, the closeness, the sheer domestic normalcy of the setting turned grotesque. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of erosion, the slow rot of resentment, the buildup of bitterness so thick it spilled into horror. And through all of it, Shadow had sensed something before Daniel ever touched the doorknob. Captain Rains entered quietly and slid a fresh report across the table. "Ballistics and toxicology came back," he said. "No gunshots, no tranquilizers. Cause of death matches what she said, blunt force trauma to the skull. The mallet was clean. Well, as clean as a murder weapon can be." Daniel looked up. "Why keep the fingers?" The captain shook his head. "We may never know, but between you and me, I think she wanted to remember hurting him, piece by piece." Daniel didn't respond. The captain leaned against the wall. "Media's calling her the stew-pot widow now. DA's thinking life without parole. No insanity plea's gonna stick." "And Shadow?" Daniel asked. The captain smiled. "Public Affairs wants to nominate him for a local valor award. He may have saved your life." Daniel gave a faint nod. He saved the truth. That night, Daniel sat on his back porch again, same spot as the night before. But something about the air felt heavier, more still. He tossed a tennis ball into the yard. Shadow bolted after it, eager, fast. For a moment, Daniel let himself smile. "Good boy," he said as the dog returned, tail wagging. The smile faded as he looked at the stars. There was no peace in justice, only closure. And sometimes even that came with splinters. Meanwhile, in her solitary cell at the county jail, Marissa Keller lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't spoken all day, hadn't eaten either. She simply lay on her bunk, hands folded across her chest, whispering something to herself that the night guard couldn't quite hear. When he passed her cell again, he paused and leaned closer. She was humming. It took him a few seconds to realize it was the same jazz tune that had been playing in her kitchen the day Daniel walked in. The stew had boiled. The story had simmered. And now, all that was left were scraps of a woman no one really knew, and a husband who never got to leave. The courtroom was silent, sterile and humming with tension, when Marissa Keller entered in her orange jumpsuit and shackles. Her hair had grown longer since her arrest, now streaked with gray and pulled back in a loose braid. She didn't look like a killer. She looked like someone's aunt, someone who might knit, bake, or volunteer at the church book drive. But everyone in that courtroom knew better. Daniel Briggs sat on the left side of the gallery, his uniform pressed, notebook balanced on his knee, Shadow lying quietly beneath his seat. The German Shepherd's presence wasn't procedural, it was symbolic. Shadow wasn't just a K9. He was the one who refused to go inside. The one who knew, somehow before anyone else, that evil was simmering on that stove. The prosecution called it one of the most methodical and unsettling domestic homicides in recent county history. The defense. They played the mental health card, claimed Marissa had suffered years of psychological abuse, that her emotional breakdown resulted in an extreme dissociative state. But the evidence didn't lie, and neither did the freezer, the pot, or the fire pit. Daniel watched from the gallery as Assistant District Attorney Haley Rhodes presented the timeline. The jury remained silent, eyes fixed, faces pale. Robert Keller had initiated divorce proceedings 2 days before his murder. He had been sleeping in the guest room. He had called his brother the night he was killed and left a voicemail that said, "She's not taking it well. I'm staying calm, but I'm scared." The jury heard that voicemail. Some visibly flinched. Rhodes played security footage of Marissa buying bleach, trash bags, and a meat grinder. She entered the local home and ranch supply in a floral sweater and left with murder prep in her trunk. She smiled at the cashier. The digital trail was airtight. Receipts, emails, deleted texts recovered from her phone. The Google search history clinched it. How to cook large meat bones. Can human fat be burned in backyard fire? What does rotting flesh smell like? One juror turned green and covered her mouth. When it was Daniel's turn to testify, he stood tall and told the truth. About the smell. About Shadow's refusal. About the moment he removed the lid and saw the hand, skin cracked, wedding band still attached. He tried not to look at Marissa. But once he did, and she was already looking at him, expressionless, as if she were watching a documentary she'd already seen a dozen times. He glanced down at Shadow, who sat calmly at his feet, eyes on the jury, tail still. A presence, a reminder. The dog who knew. Back at the precinct, Daniel sat with Carla Monroe and reviewed the final forensic package. The trial was nearly over, but one piece remained unresolved. "What about the burner phone?" Daniel asked. Carla handed over a bagged phone, recovered from a false ceiling panel in the master bedroom. "One text sent from it," she said, "to a number in town registered to a Samantha Carter, graduate student at the university, English Lit." Daniel frowned. "The one Robert was supposedly having an affair with?" "Yeah." She never responded. Said she didn't even know Robert beyond one class he guest lectured. But the text said, "Get this, he's yours, come get him." Come. "So she baited her?" Daniel said. Carla nodded. "She wanted this girl to show up. Maybe find the body, maybe be blamed, or maybe just to watch her crumble knowing she was too late." Daniel leaned back, his mind spinning. "She didn't snap," he said quietly. "She wanted someone to see the fallout." The verdict came in on a Friday. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence, obstruction. Marissa showed no emotion, no tears, no pleading. She declined to speak before sentencing. But after the hearing, while being led out of the courtroom, she turned to Daniel and said, "You think I'm the monster, but I was just the final act. He made the stage." Daniel said nothing. He didn't have to. Shadow, sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom doors, gave a soft growl as she passed. It was the only sound anyone heard. Weeks later, as the town moved on and the news vans disappeared, Daniel found himself thinking more about what could have happened. If Shadow hadn't stopped at the door, if he'd listened to the lies, if he hadn't smelled what no one else could. One day, while jogging with Shadow at the old abandoned trail behind the high school, Daniel stopped near the ridge and looked out across the trees. "Did we get all of it?" he asked out loud. Shadow sat, ears alert, nose twitching. Daniel reached into his vest and pulled out the commendation plaque Shadow had received. For bravery and exceptional instinct in active duty, and smiled. "Still don't know how you do it." Shadow gave a small huff like he was tired of the praise. Daniel laughed. "All right, let's go." Later that night, Daniel went back to the Keller case file one last time. There was one more photo he hadn't been able to look at, one from the attic of the burned wedding album. He opened it. In the photo, Marissa sat on a bench beside Robert. She wasn't smiling. In fact, she looked away from the camera, toward something or someone not in the frame. A shadow blurred the edge of the shot. He flipped to the last page. A handwritten note had been tucked into the back of the album. Missed during evidence collection, it had just resurfaced. It read, "If he leaves, I disappear. If I disappear, no one remembers me. But if he disappears, I become the story. M." Daniel stared at the paper. He thought about all the crime scenes he'd been to, the blood, the weapons, the aftermath. But this one? This one was about identity, about control, about vanishing in reverse. That weekend, the town held a canine recognition ceremony in the Oakwood Hills Civic Center. Local families brought their kids. The mayor handed out medals, and when Shadow walked across the small wooden stage wearing his vest and badge, the room erupted in applause. He didn't bark, didn't perform, just stood still, like a soldier. Daniel knelt beside him, accepted the certificate, and spoke briefly. "I've been in law enforcement for 15 years, seen some darkness. But this case reminded me, evil doesn't always come with a weapon. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it serves you dinner." He paused. "And sometimes the one who saves you doesn't speak at all. He just refuses to go in." 6 months had passed. The leaves had turned gold in Oakwood Hills, and the house on Waverly Drive had been sold. The new owners repainted the shutters, planted petunias, and tried not to flinch whenever a neighbor whispered, "That was the Keller place." But no amount of new paint could bleach out a memory like that. Daniel Briggs no longer patrolled the streets. After the Keller case, he took a promotion, senior field investigator, overseeing major crimes across 3 counties. It was more desk work, more case files, and fewer sudden calls to face horror behind a front door. But he still rode with Shadow every day. The dog, now 7 years old, had grown a little grayer around the muzzle, but the fire in his eyes remained. He still perked up at the sound of sirens, still growled at strangers who lingered too long near Daniel's truck, still refused to enter a home unless he felt it was safe. And Daniel? He had never trusted another creature, man or dog, more in his life. The town had moved on in the way small towns always do. People talked about it in the barber shop, murmured about it in the church lobby. A few true crime podcasts picked up the story, dubbing Marissa the Stew Widow and speculating about whether she had killed before. But Daniel knew the truth. It hadn't been about practice. It had been about purpose. Marissa had wanted the last word. And in a way, she got it. Her trial made national news. Her courtroom stills became memes. Her mugshot was shared over 3 million times. But she never spoke again. No interviews, no letters, no outbursts. She just disappeared into the system. Daniel sat in his office one Thursday afternoon, flipping through a sealed evidence envelope marked Exhibit 41F, the final photo taken from the attic. It was a picture of Robert Keller holding a glass of red wine, smiling on his back deck. In the corner of the frame was a familiar silhouette, Shadow. The photo had been taken 3 weeks before the murder. The Kellers had hosted a local neighborhood fundraiser for the animal shelter. Daniel had brought Shadow. "I guess you were watching her even back then," he said, running a finger along the plastic sleeve. Shadow lifted his head from under the desk. "Yeah, I'm talking about you." The dog thumped his tail once and went back to sleep. That weekend, Daniel drove out to Jefferson Elementary for a canine safety and awareness program. The school had invited him to speak, and the gym was packed with 2nd and 3rd graders holding coloring books and plastic police hats. Shadow, in full vest and badge, walked proudly beside him. "Can he sniff out candy?" one kid asked. "Only the chocolate," Daniel joked. Another girl raised her hand. "How did your dog catch the bad guy?" Daniel paused. "He didn't catch her exactly, he just knew something wasn't right. And he made me stop long enough to figure it out." The kids clapped like he'd told them a superhero story, and maybe in a way he had. Later that day, Daniel sat in his truck outside a familiar building, the county jail. He hadn't been back in months. He asked to see her. They brought Marissa into the visitation room in standard orange, still quiet, still composed. No shackles this time, just an armed guard nearby and a layer of thick glass between them. She picked up the phone. Daniel did too. "What do you want?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe I thought you'd tell me why." She tilted her head. "I already did." "No," Daniel said. You told me what he did, not why you did what you did. Marissa leaned closer to the glass.
He wanted to make me invisible. I chose something louder.
Daniel stared at her, wondering how a person could say something like that so calmly. You didn't just end his life, he said. You tried to erase him. Her mouth twitched. I erased myself too, that was the point. He stood. We found your journals, your letters, the planning. You didn't snap, you chose. I did. He looked down at the phone, and Shadow knew. She smiled, just for a second.
He's a good dog.
Daniel didn't reply. He hung up the phone and walked out. Outside, the sun was setting. Shadow sat by the truck, tail wagging slowly. He stood up as Daniel approached, leaning into his handler's leg. Daniel knelt and scratched behind the ears.
She said you're a good dog.
Shadow gave a little huff. She's wrong, you're the best. They stood together in the gravel lot, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. No words. No need. Months later, a memorial was unveiled at the Oakwood Hills Police Department. Not for Robert Keller, not for Marissa. For Shadow. A bronze statue, life-sized, standing alert, was placed near the flagpole outside the main entrance. The plaque read, Canine Shadow. For refusing to ignore what others might have missed. For protecting his partner. For making sure the truth had a voice, without ever speaking a word. Daniel retired the following year. Not from law enforcement entirely, he stayed on as an advisor, but from the daily beat. Shadow, too, was retired with full honors. They moved to a cabin on the edge of the Smoky Mountains, where mornings were quiet, trails were endless, and neither man nor dog had to explain themselves to anyone. Shadow still barked at the occasional hiker, still chased squirrels with teenage energy. But his patrol days were done. And Daniel was okay with that, because some stories don't need sequels. Some just need to be remembered. Thank you for following the story of Officer Daniel Briggs and Canine Shadow. At Heroes for Animals, we're proud to bring you real and inspired stories that celebrate the incredible instincts, loyalty, and courage of working dogs across the world. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where a dog sensed something before you did? Or maybe you've known an animal who just knew when something wasn't right? Tell us your story in the comments below. We read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful animal hero stories.